forget that. Okay. And this seminar today is in collaboration with Moses Beer, and Moti is here. I believe he's going to say a few words to introduce his business. And this is a recent partnership between Moses Beer and Lallemand to make all the brewing product available to you in Israel, especially the new products. Moti, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, please. So first of all, thank you for everybody that joining the webinar. We are proud to distribute Lallemand in Israel for the brewing sector, and we are trying, and we will keep having stock most or almost complete all varieties of the yeast, and also some specific varieties that customer need. We will of course order it and have it stocked. Now we have a very stable stock level of varieties, and also the new varieties that arrived, and what Sylvie will tell us about. And I'm very happy for this webinar, and wish for us successful and good businesses, and support from Lallemand and from me, what you need. I will be happy to serve. So again, thank you very much to join us, and Sylvie, it's your table.
Thank you, Mari. And I do believe these kind of sessions are really important. We're dealing with very technical products, and we certainly make it our priority to be supportive of the market. And so we have a global team of technical people that is available to answer questions and support you, Mati, and support your customers. I just want to make sure everybody feels comfortable and free to contact us with any questions. So what we're going to do today is obviously a brief presentation. I mean, we can talk about yeast all day. I certainly can. We can do more of these type of webinars. I would love to have the feedback from all of you who are listening today, to see if you find this useful and if we can do more on different topics, etc. So you can maybe share your feedback with Mati afterwards. During the presentation, you can feel free to just unmute and ask me questions as we go along, or you can be asking questions in the chat as well. You see, I don't know if you're familiar with GoToMeeting, but next to the icon with the number of people attending, you have a little bubble, and then that's where you can ask questions. That's the chat. So if it's in the chat, I won't see it until the end, and I can answer the question at the end, or you can ask your question orally at the end as well. Okay. Again, this is not formal by any means. I would love to have some interaction, and Mati, this goes for you as well. If you have any questions, please, or if you think I'm going in the wrong direction or whatever, please intervene. Okay, so I have about 20 slides here to go through.
Okay.
Yes? Do you have a question?
No, okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'll get started, and then again, it's good you stay on mute, and then if you have a question, please unmute and let me know or put it in the chat. Okay, I'm going to put this on presentation mode. Okay, can someone just confirm that you are seeing the slides? Mati, can you confirm that you are seeing the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's very nice. It's okay.
Okay, so as I said, today we'll talk about Lallemand, we'll talk about our portfolio and some of the solutions we have for you today, and then obviously we'll answer your questions afterwards. So Lallemand Inc., so the Lallemand parent company has has about 13 different businesses, and Brewing is one of them, obviously here in the middle, because that's what we're going to talk about today. But Lallemand is a manufacturer and a producer of bacteria and yeast in dry and also in liquid form, depending the market. And those are all the different markets that Lallemand is involved in. And beside brewing, we also have, in terms of alcoholic beverage, we have wine and we have distilled spirits as well. At Lallemand Brewing, we have the business itself. Lallemand Brewing is composed of 3 different activities, one of them being yeast and bacteria, the part that I look after. Then we have an educational part with the Siebel Institute of Technology, that is a brewing school based in Chicago. And then the third part is processing aids, a company called AB Vickers, based in the UK in Burton-on-Trent. And AB Vickers is a manufacturer and a distributor of and some of the products Motier has actually got on board. So there's going to be nutrients, enzymes, clarifying agents, anti-foam, this kind of thing, right? So between AB Vickers, the Siebel Institute of Technology, and the Lallemand Yeast and Bacteria, this is what shapes Lallemand Brewing. And all of this coming together is what we offer to the market. So it's not just yeast and bacteria, it's a lot more than that, and it's especially education and support with our products to the market. So going into the brewing yeast, what we so when I've been with Lallemand quite a long time. I didn't introduce myself a little bit. I am originally from Belgium. I am now living in the United States. I am in Las Vegas here. It's a morning time, and I did a brewing degree in Belgium, and then I went on to study yeast in more details. I have a PhD in yeast from the UK, and I joined Lallemand in 2004. And in 2004, the brewing business was a very small part of Lallemand, and over the years the business has developed, but it's really in the last 4 to 5 years that we have made big changes for this business. So some of you may be familiar with the name Nottingham, which was a yeast that which is our most popular yeast, and the yeast we started with 30 years ago. But the new products have come on board, especially in the last few years. So the idea is to provide, our strategy is really to provide new products, to give the brewers some tools to create fantastic beer and make it easy for them, right? So it's very exciting time for us. It's exciting time for you as well. Excuse me. With all these new products coming on board, and the new yeast, we always look for something that's pretty unique. I would love to hear from you what you think would be great to have in our portfolio, and maybe you can put that in the chat. Like, if you could have any yeast, what would it be, and what would that yeast do? That would be a great information to have. But our newest product, our Voss, very performant yeast. We'll talk about it later in the presentation. The Verdant, and then before that we launched New England corn. So a lot of new products coming in. So that's for Lal Brew, what we call Lal Brew. So those are premium yeast, dry yeast, but we also have another brand which is called Wild Brew. So if you consider all these yeast to be more traditional brewing yeast, lager or ale, then Wild Brew is going a little bit off the beaten track, I would say, and looking for different organisms that may be giving different characteristics to beer and that are very unique. So some of them are bacteria. Obviously, these are used for sour beers. and for kettle souring, and there's 2 of them. Again, we'll go in more details later. And then our first yeast, again, it's in the wild category because it is not a Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So if we go back here, these are all Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast, except for Diamond, which is a lager, a Pastorianus. But this one is a Lachantia. So it's a completely different yeast, and it's a yeast that can also acidify, produce lactic acid, so for sour beer. So those 2, Lal Brew and Wild Brew, are our 2 brands categories where we will be putting new products in. For the dry yeast we produce, because this is all very European based, although the company is Canadian and I am based in the United States, our operations for brewing are all in Europe. We produce, package, warehouse, and ship all our brewing yeast from Vienna. This is our plant in the center of, at the heart of the Austrian capital, and it's next to also a brewery called Ottakringen. Now, the brewery has nothing to do with Lallemand, but it's on the site of this brewery. It's a beautiful site. And so all the yeast is produced there at to the highest quality, and is shipped to Israel from Austria. Quality is at the is obviously the most important part of this process. I guess maybe that's why it took a long time for us to be able to expand the portfolio to what it is now. And even then, we want to do a lot more. We want to get to give you access to a lot more strains, but you have to know that to dry yeast is a very technical and very delicate process, especially brewing yeast. They are very sensitive to temperature. So to dry them takes a lot of good work. And also when you dry them, you want to make sure that when you rehydrate them or when you put them in fermentation, they will be active and alive. So for this, we do a lot of testing on the yeast to make sure the yeast is the best quality. So the kind of things we're going to look at are viability. So whether the yeast is live or dead. So how many live cells do you have in your dry yeast? Vitality. So it's good to be alive, but how active are you? Contamination with bacteria, wild yeast. The performance. These are what you can see here on the slide is called a tall tube fermentation. So every batch of yeast will be fermented to produce beer, to make sure there is no off flavor, and to make sure the fermentation or the fermentation curve is actually adequate and fast enough. Okay, and then we also do some genetic work here. You can see this. This is what we call a fingerprint, to make sure that the yeast that's in the pack is really that particular yeast. So if it's a pack of Nottingham, you want to make sure it's Nottingham in there and not another yeast, and also that there is no cross contamination with other yeast. So every yeast, just like every one of us, will have a different fingerprint, because it's a different, every strain of yeast is a different organism, just like you are all different, we are all different. So this is called a fingerprint. It's kind of a unique identity to the yeast. And that way we can make sure the profile, the fingerprint of Nottingham is different to the fingerprint of Windsor or Belle Saison, etc. So that's our way we can differentiate all our different strains. Something I want to point out, again, we only have the time we have today, but we can go in a lot more detail offline, or if you have questions afterwards, is the presence of what we call Saccharomyces cerevisiae var diastaticus. So this particular strain, and we have one strain which is of this species, and that's Belle Saison. So Saison strains are yeast that will attenuate very, very high. They can use all the sugars. It's very good for dry beer, so it's very good for high alcohol beer or for a Saison, which typically are very dry. But this particular yeast, it's very important that you don't cross-contaminate it with others. So if it's in your brewery or at home, if you are brewing at home, you want to make sure you clean properly after you've used this yeast. In our case, it is Belle Saison, so that you don't find it contaminating other brews. This particular species has caused a lot of damage in some breweries, because if the fermentation is not finished and you bottle or you can the beer, you will and you may run the risk of having the fermentation happening in the bottle and or in the can, and then cause an explosion. Okay, so it's very important. It's a fantastic yeast. That's not what I'm saying. Belle Saison is a great yeast for Saison beer, but you need to pay attention to this yeast, particularly in terms of cleaning. And us, as a yeast producer, we also make sure this yeast is not being not contaminating our other yeast, right? You don't want to mix Belle Saison with Nottingham, because Nottingham has a specific attenuation, and Belle Saison has a higher attenuation. So we are basically producing this yeast in a completely different location, not in Vienna, which I showed you earlier, to make sure there's no cross-contamination. For every yeast, you have a technical data sheet. Again, I think after the presentation or later on with Moti, I would like to provide you with more information for every yeast. And you will see on the technical data sheet, you have what's called microbiological properties. And in there, it tells you that Diastaticus is not detectable. It also gives you more information on live cells and contamination, etc. We have a particular document that is associated with Diastaticus. Those we call best practices. You see here, we have a number of those documents that I would like to share with you as well if you are interested. They are technical documents to provide information. Now, rehydration or no rehydration, that's quite kind of a question that's always being asked in terms of dry yeast, and I would say the position has changed over the years. If you read any document on dry yeast from 20 years ago, they will say rehydrate, 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 right? The fact is the quality of the dry yeast is such these days, and there's so much improvement that have been made in the quality of it, that you don't really need to rehydrate anymore. So I don't know if this is news to you or not, because you may have your way of doing things, and that's perfectly fine. Rehydration is not damaging to the yeast, but not rehydrating is not damaging either. And in fact, it's a lot easier. So if you are used to rehydrate, if you have experience with it, by all means, keep rehydrating. But if you don't want to rehydrate, or if you think it's too risky in terms of contamination, or you don't want to spend the time doing it, don't. The yeasts are absolutely fine without rehydration. I would say the cases where you may want to consider rehydrating is when you have very high gravity, because it's stressful for the yeast, or with lager yeast, because they are more sensitive. They don't like high temperature. They're just more sensitive to stress in general, or when you want to bottle condition. So if you're adding dry yeast in your bottle to bottle condition, it's better to rehydrate before that. Okay. Let me have a look at the chat. Maybe I can answer some question right now, because I saw some questions coming in. Okay, so the difference, Neil, the difference pitch temperature has on phenolic for Munich strain, I can answer offline, because I need to give you the exact values, etc. So I can send you the right information. Oh, thank you for sending suggestion. Please keep sending suggestion on yeast that you think would be great. And then what yeast would you recommend for low attenuation? So for low, that's a good question too. So for low attenuation, like if you were doing a lower alcohol beer, for example, we would recommend a yeast that doesn't use maltotriose. So that would be like London or Windsor, those two strains. And I will send also in a best practice that explains how to brew lower alcohol beer, because that's also something that is being asked a lot recently. Now, we don't have a specific yeast for it, but if you use a special mashing program plus a yeast that doesn't use maltotriose, you can get as low as 1% alcohol or even lower. So you don't need to use a special yeast. You need to use a yeast that attenuates lower, and also a special mashing program. And I will send that information. Okay, going back to the presentation. Okay, on the website itself, there are a lot of information that you may want to use. By the way, we are currently developing an application for smartphone with all these tools as well, so you can do it on your phone. But for now, on the website, there is what we call brewing tools or brewer's corner. And in there you have a number of tools, but one of them is the pitching rate calculator, which you may find useful. There's a pitching rate calculator for fermentation with different volume for home brew, for commercial batches, but also for bottle conditioning, if you use dry yeast for bottle conditioning. So please have a look at this. Something I want to, because yeast is what I know. Yeast is what I studied. One thing that I spend a lot of time on is studying what stresses yeast. And unfortunately, there are a lot of stresses during fermentation. Obviously, yeast loves eating sugar and producing alcohol, but there are ways you can keep your yeast happy and make sure it doesn't have any stress. This is mostly important when you reuse yeast. If you're going to use the dry yeast just once, then you don't have that issue, because the yeast is super happy, super healthy when it comes in the pack. You use it and that's it. If you start reusing the yeast, then that's where you run the risk of causing stress. So I'm not saying you cannot reuse the yeast. You can. That there is no scientific reason why you could not reuse the yeast, but you need to pay a lot more attention to the health of the yeast if you're going to start reusing it. Some yeast are going to be more sensitive to stress than others. That's just like any of us. Some of us are more stressed than others. That's just the way we are. And that's the same for the yeast. Some are going to be more sensitive to temperature. Some are going to be sensitive to alcohol levels or high level of sugars. So you have to know the yeast that you use. And that's our role as a yeast supplier, to give you that information. So again, on that technical data sheet, you have a lot of information regarding each yeast. And one of the things to look at is resistance to alcohol. So for each yeast, it will tell you how much alcohol can be produced. So for example, Nottingham will be able to produce 12% or 14% of alcohol with the right nutrition. But other yeast are going to be a lot more sensitive to alcohol than Nottingham. So every yeast is different. So if you're going to do a bold beer with a lot of alcohol, make sure you're using the right strain for that. Make sure you follow the pitching rate. That's why I showed you the calculator, is because, again, some strains are going to need more yeast. You're going to need more cells in there. They are more sensitive strain. New England, BRY 97, those typically work better with a higher pitching rate. Okay, and then if you look at Voss, the Kveik yeast, which works really well, and the Nottingham, they work very well with a lower pitch. Also, sometimes you want to pitch less cell because you want to have more flavor. You know that when you under pitch, you create more esters. So that's something you may want to do with Munich Classic, for example, if you want more banana in your beer. Okay. And then zinc. Zinc is the only, I would say, that is the #1 mineral that you want to have in your brewing fermentation, because zinc, you need zinc to produce alcohol. The yeast cell uses zinc to transform acetaldehyde into ethanol. If you don't have zinc, you cannot do that step of the biochemical pathway. So there is zinc in wort. There is zinc coming from malt, but having extra zinc can really help protect the yeast, especially if you're going to do a high alcohol level or if you're going to reuse the yeast. Okay, so pay attention to zinc level. And Cervomyces is a yeast enriched in zinc, and you can just add a pinch of it. Literally is very little. And we even have it for homebrew in little capsules, and that's what's going to give the boost that the yeast need to protect itself against stress.
Sylvia?
Yes.
You mentioned the Kveik Voss and underpitching, and I'll be glad to ask a couple of questions.
Yeah.
First, do you recommend to underpitch the Voss Kveik, which is a pretty popular thing to do with the Kveik yeast in general?
Yes, absolutely. And again, on the document I can send you afterwards, you're going to have information. So underpitching Voss will create a little bit more of the esters. So you're going to have more of the citrusy flavor, orangey flavor, than if you underpitch. And Voss is a very resistant yeast. It's very robust. It loves high temperature. So again, if you're going to use Voss at high temperature and you underpitch, you're going to get a little bit more ester flavor. So it really depends if you want something really clean, really fast, done and done, or if you want something a little bit more complex. But yes, you can definitely underpitch Voss or underpitch Nottingham and still have very good fermentation. That is a quite a traditional way of using Voss.
Yes. And the second question about Kveik as well is, are we expected to see any other dried Kveik in the future?
Yeah, we actually are looking at others right now. We just want to make sure they are different in the way, either temperature wise or different in the flavor that they give. But that is one area we are focusing on, yes. And in fact, before we launched Voss, we looked at about 25 different Kveik isolate. A lot of them are actually mixed cultures. Mixed cultures are not ideal to dry because you can't get the consistency. If you're drying a mix, you are risking not to have the same mix every single time. So we are looking at single strains, and we isolated, like I said, about 25 of them. And we are testing them right now to see what the next one could be. But again, I think it's important to be able to offer something different, different in terms of performance or in terms of flavor. So that's what we're looking at for the next Kveik strain that we will put on the market. But for us, as a dry yeast supplier, Kveik is an amazing yeast because it dries very well. And that is not the case for all brewing yeasts, especially for lagers. They're very difficult to dry, and Kveik is the original dry yeast. I mean, that's how they kept the Kveik dry. Originally in Norway, through centuries, they kept it dry. So one can say is the original dry yeast if you want. Obviously the way they dried it is very different to what we do, but it's a yeast that is very used to being desiccated. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
We'll talk about Kveik a little bit more later as well. So to finish here, why do I mention stress? Why is that important? So when the yeast is stressed, and again, remember, this is only really an issue if you're going to reuse the yeast, because the yeast in the pack is not stressed at all. Stress can cause a lot of default in your beer in terms of taste, in terms of fermentation profile. So it could stop attenuating, or it could stop flocculating. So there's a number of things that can happen if you stress the yeast, and that's why it's important to pay attention to it. And cell death autolyzing is also causing off flavor. So you want to keep your yeast happy. Again, I'm not going to give you all the answers today. It's a very complicated science, but fascinating science. And if you want more information on how to keep your yeast happy, we have those documents for you. Okay, so now I'm going to move more into what I call the solution package or solution toolkits, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them today. You see, I could have talked about low alcohol. If that's interesting for you, we can talk about low alcohol on another seminar. But today I want to talk about sour beer, performance, and then IPAs. So for sour beer, we have 3 different products at this point. In fact, we have 4, because we also have a genetically modified yeast, but that one is only sold in the US. So I'm not going to talk about it today, but just to let you know that it's a very strong focus for us, sour beers, because it's a little bit of a renaissance for that style. So sour beer is not new. It was produced in Germany, in Belgium for centuries ago. It was very popular, but the sour beer that you see these days are kind of a new trend, and there's no limit to the creation with sour beers. And now you see sour IPAs, and you see a lot of different new style of beer that you haven't seen in the last few decades. So it's a strong focus. So 2 of those products are bacteria, so dry bacteria. This is for kettle souring, so it means you use it to sour the wort, and then you go into fermentation. The advantage of this is that you're killing the bacteria after you've soured the wort. You go into boil, and the bacteria is dead. So there's no risk of cross-contamination, whether it's at home or whether it's in a brewery. You basically have a very, very low risk, because you keep your bacteria on the hot side and you're not moving your bacteria to the cold side. Okay, so that's the important thing to remember. And different bacteria will give different souring, different souring level, and different aroma and flavor. These are here, the Helveticus peach and sour peach are both lactobacillus, but they are different species. So one is Lactobacillus plantarum and the other one is Helveticus. Okay, and in fact, the sour peach was the first one we launched, and the souring was kind of average and kind of all around very good bacteria for a lot of style of sour beer, and Helveticus is a lot more sour, produces a lot more lactic acid, and this was a request also from the market for something a little bit more extreme. Then the other solution we have for sour beer is the wild brew Philly sour. So that's the Lachenzia yeast that I mentioned earlier. So this is not the Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's a yeast that can produce lactic acid and ethanol. So you don't need to do a kettle sour. You don't need to use bacteria. You use this in fermentation. And it's a slowish yeast because it's not a Saccharomyces cerevisiae, so it's slow at fermenting. But it first produces the lactic acid. You can see the pH here dropping, and then it will ferment. So it will take longer, 10 to 12 days, to get to the right attenuation. Or if you want it faster, you can mix it. You can mix it. You can use it to produce the lactic acid and then use the Voss or Nottingham to finish off the fermentation. Okay. We notice that when you add more glucose, you get more peach, so more stone fruit character. And again, the type of beer that you can use it for would be any sour with fruit, or traditional Gose or Berliner Weiss from Germany, or any hoppy sour ales. I mentioned IPAs, sour IPAs, which is something that's becoming quite popular. Any
Is
questions?
the Philly yeast repeatable? Having these two phases of fermentation?
It is repeatable. Yes, absolutely. It is repeatable. And it flocculates extremely well. It really, it's not a Saccharomyces, so it's a very different mode of flocculation. And it really, like, I wish I had the video to show you, but the way it flocculates is it forms like a blob. I guess that's the best way to explain it. It's a blob, and it's very easy to harvest and reuse. Okay. Again, if you're gonna reuse, you want to make sure your yeast is kept happy. So don't store it for weeks. Reuse it quite quickly. Make sure you keep it cold, and you may want to give an extra bit of nutrition to make sure it's happy. Okay. But yes, you can reuse. All of our yeast can be reused, basically. All of the dry yeast can be reused.
And it will still first sour and then move to the alcoholic
Yes,
fermentation.
first it sours. In a couple of days, it will bring the pH down, and then it will start using the sugar slowly. So that's why you really need to wait until it finishes the fermentation. If the fermentation gets stuck, you may want to add another yeast to finish off the fermentation. It's with all non-Saccharomyces yeast are typically very good at giving flavor. They're very what we call bio-flavoring, but they're not very good fermenters. So if either you have the time and the patience, or you add another yeast once you have your lactic acid, so that you can finish off quickly. And you know what? A lot of experiments are being done with Philly sour and Belle Saison. And Belle Saison is the yeast that attenuates super high, super dry beer. The diastaticus one that I mentioned earlier, and Saison is very peppery, and it really contrasts with the flavor from the Philly sour. So if you want to mix Philly sour and then 2 days after you add Belle Saison to finish off really dry and really fast, that's a fantastic beer. Philly sour and Belle Saison. Right, now we're going back to the discussion on Voss. So what we call performance solution. There are a couple of yeast in our portfolio that we would call high performance. One of them is the Voss Kveik, and the other one is the Nottingham. So why is Voss so performant? Voss is a very is a Kveik from Western Norway. So it's actually, the region is called Voss. That's where it comes from. And the meaning of Kveik is actually yeast in a Norwegian dialect. It also means to breathe a new life into something. So it's a very beautiful the history of that yeast and how that yeast was kept alive through centuries is very interesting. If you want to know more, there's a lot of blogs out there on Kveik yeast. But we chose the Voss because it was a single strain, and it was one of the one that was the most popular, and people were really asking for this one. This particular yeast again, is very good for drying. Here you have the picture. That's how they used to dry it. They would just dry it on paper or on a ring of wood, and that's how they would keep the yeast alive, and they would reuse it, reuse it, reuse it. Yeah. And again, in that region of Norway, there's a lot of different cultures. Basically, every single farm would have a different culture of kveik. So Voss is one of them. Yeah. And what's very interesting with this strain is that you can brew at really high temperature. I'm not joking. Voss really loves 40 C temperature. 35, 40 C is perfect for Voss. It's going to ferment in 2 days. It's going to be very clean. Okay. So this, you know, could be useful beside obviously making good beer very fast. It's for some breweries that, or microbreweries or brew pubs that have, and I'm thinking of specific regions where the climate is super hot and where you have issues keeping the temperature stable of fermentation. Voss is giving you, it's very forgiving. So even if the temperature fluctuates, you're not going to get any off flavors. And that's
like in Israel.
Say that again.
In Israel, the temperature, the hot temperature in Israel would be helpful. This.
Yes, so there's no off flavor up to 40. I mean, it's a very unique yeast. Like there's no other yeast that works that way. That can ferment super high with no off flavor. So even if you fluctuate, you know, between 30 and 40 during fermentation, you should get a beautiful, you should still get a beautiful beer. And if you look on the right here, for all our yeast, we have what we call a flavor wheel. This gives you a quick idea of what the yeast is all about in terms of flavor and aroma. This is the neutral. As I was saying, Voss is very clean, especially at high temperature. If you want to have some tropical fruit, you either have to lower the temperature or to underpitch, as we were saying earlier, and then you can get some tropical fruit. Okay. If you go to 40 degree, you ferment in 2 days and it's very clean. Okay. So you can play with it. You can play with the temperature without any damage whatsoever. It's a fantastic yeast to play around with. And it's very it has a high flocculation because that's how the yeast was kept over generation. It flocculates well, so you can reuse it. And that's why those farms were keeping these yeast for forever. And fortunately for us, they have given us now those cultures so that we can share them with the rest of the world. And you can use Voss. So there is not a beer. There's not a beer style called kveik. Kveik is really the yeast. It's not a beer. So with a kveik yeast or with Voss in this case, you can do pretty much any style you want because it's very neutral. Again, so you may not want to do a saison or you may not want to do an Hefeweizen where we're looking for specific flavor, but otherwise you can make any type of ales or IPAs with this yeast. Okay. And then the other yeast that I wanted to mention is Nottingham as a performance yeast, because this yeast is very unique and it has also a wide window of temperature, but different to Voss. So Voss, you see, 25 to 40 degree, and Nottingham 10 to 25. So in fact, with both of them, you have 10 to 40 degrees Celsius. But what Nottingham can do is you can use it to brew lager yeast because it will work at 10 degrees Celsius. Now, some kveik are also good at fermenting at lower temperature. This, for example, would be something we would look at if we were to put a new product on the market. But this Voss doesn't work at 10 degrees Celsius, but some other cuvées do. So Nottingham, you can brew lager yeast, you can brew ale yeast. It's very neutral. If you compare to Voss, at least there's some tropical fruit here. Nottingham is really the cleanest of all yeast. Yeah, and some breweries are using Nottingham for all their beers because, again, it's a very performant yeast but doesn't produce any flavor. So if the flavor comes from the malt or from the hops, that's what you want to use. Yeah, so your hops and your malt can shine, but the yeast is neutral. And that is our, still to this day, that is our most popular yeast, both in homebrew and for microbreweries. And also we are selling this yeast to very large brewing companies. So it's again, it's very popular. Any questions before I move to IPAs, which is my last set of slides? Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
I wanted to ask, hi, about the attenuation of the Kvik yeast, your species.
Yes.
What's
So
the attenuation?
it's a good attenuation. You're looking at 78-80% attenuation. It's a good attenuation,
Okay.
but it's not, obviously it's going to use maltotriose, so it's similar to Nottingham. It's a high
Okay.
attenuation, but it's not like Belle Saison, obviously. So then moving to the last solution package that I want to talk about is IPAs. So that's another one of our focus in terms of research, is to find solution for brewers to create their best IPAs and also to differentiate or enhance IPAs. Okay, so with using different strains of yeast, you can really change the end result. So let's say you have the same wort and the same hop. Using different yeast strain will give you a different beer. Why? Because there's a different enzymatic activity present in the yeast. One of these enzymatic activity is beta-glucosidase, but there's others. Those are called biotransformation. I don't know if you're familiar with this word. Biotransformation is used a lot. It's a big hot word these days. It's really here we're talking about the interaction between hops and yeast and what this marriage can create. And it's very interesting from a sensory perspective and from a scientific perspective. And so, as I said, you can play around with different yeast, even if you have the same base recipe, and you will have different flavor. So we have 3 yeasts that are dedicated for IPAs. One of them is BRY97, which is more like an American West Coast ale yeast, so like a Sierra Nevada type beer, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And then you also have New England, which is East Coast IPA, that is more of the hazy style IPA. And this one would have a lot more. If you look at the flavor, this is very tropical fruit, stone fruit orientated, and this one is very neutral. But again, those yeasts will interact with the hop, depending which hop you're using, and create something quite unique. Now, our latest yeast is from the UK, and that's a Verdun IPA. So Verdun, it comes from an area of the UK called Cornwall, and this yeast was isolated from the brewery Verdun in Cornwall, and this one has again a different profile compared to to BRY 97 in New England. So I think there was a question on the flavor profile. I don't have the wheel here. It's a little bit in between those two. So it's not going to be as neutral. It's going to have a little more tropical fruit, but not as much as New England. So it's kind of a good compromise between the two. So you have a West Coast, a East Coast, and then a UK IPA style yeast. And then again, if you want to have a look at this best practice here for IPAs, you have all the different here. You have the Verdun here. You see, the wheel has a lot more stone fruit, a lot more peach fruit, and then some red apple as well. So here, in comparison, you can look at all the wheels and you can see the different aroma and flavor that you can give to your IPA. So we will send this to you so you can have a look at it. And then one more thing on IPA is we launched months ago an enzyme called aromazyme. It's actually a beta-glucosidase. So if you remember, I just mentioned that in yeast you have enzymatic activity. This enzymatic activity will react with the hop and enhance your IPA. Now, if you use a pure enzyme, you're really bringing that enzymatic reaction to the next level. So you are really boosting enzymatic reaction between the hops, and you're releasing a lot more aroma from the hops that would have normally been trapped in the hop. So it would not have impacted, but because you use an enzyme and the enzyme will go and cut those extra aroma, you release them in the beer and you create a new profile. So if you have an IPA that you are happy with and you try the enzyme and compare, then you can see what we call the enhancement. So typically the feedback that we get is that it's always better, but in terms of why it's better, that could be so many things. So it's going to be a question of taste and a question of, obviously what you want and what you like, but it's worth trying. And if any one of you would like to run some trials, we can certainly organize this very easily with a sample of this enzyme. It is a powder and it's added during fermentation, at the beginning of the fermentation, to interact with the hop. So it's mostly for IPAs when you dry hop. Yeah. Okay.
It's come.
Yeah.
Just a question. The aroma enzyme is come with the 11 grams and
no.
pack.
That one is 100 gram. It's a powder. It's a little tub. Again, it was just launched last month, and you need to. So it would be 100 grams. So it's about 5 to 6 gram per hectoliter. So if you were doing a home brew, you could add 3 grams or 2 grams. And then if you do a commercial 1 hectoliter brew, then you would add 6 grams. But it comes in 100 gram little tub. Yeah.
Okay.
So what we could do is organize. I mean, we could send you. We could send a tub and then distribute some of this enzyme. It's very stable. It's 4 years. It's very stable. It's powder, and just to try to see what you're getting when you add this enzyme to your IPAs, and then with the feedback we could maybe present the feedback even to this group again. So there's many things we can do, but we always look for feedback, and we're very happy to conduct trial with anyone that is interested in trying our products.
Thank you.
So to conclude, let me see. Well, okay, we're getting to an hour here. So to conclude, I think the message today was number one, that keep your yeast happy. So again, if you buy dry yeast, we've done all the work for you. It's very healthy. It's very stable. Follow the instructions, right? Read the technical data sheet. Go on the website. Ask us for question. Ask Moti for question. You have, every yeast is different. You got to know your yeast. You got to know the temperature tolerance. You got to know the alcohol tolerance. You got to know the pitching rate. All of this is important to make the best beer. Okay, if you're going to reuse the yeast, it's even more important to look after your yeast. And then again, I suggest you look at the best practices that we have put together for this. What else? Look at the sensory. Every yeast will produce different aroma, different flavor. Look at those wheels. Those wheels are there to help you choose which yeast you want to use for what beer. We also have charts on beer style versus which yeast to use for what beer style. That's also available to you. And then don't be afraid to try different things. That's why we're here there for as well. When I'm talking about co-inoculation or sequential inoculation, first one yeast and then another yeast after to finish off the fermentation. Or if you want to try a sour beer and you never made a sour beer before, ask for advice. We have the solutions that are meant to make your life easy, so that you can create sour beers at home or even in the smallest facility without risking contaminating the brewery with bacteria, for example. So yeah, I very much encourage the communication and the discussion. But I would like to look now at your, if you have more questions, first of all, on the chat. So we have, regarding the drying process, okay, so the drying process is not lyophilization. Lyophilization, that is mostly for keeping yeast into a culture collection. What we used is a fluidized bed dryer. So what's the difference is that you want to use, excuse me, let me get rid of that. You want to use a very gentle way to dry the yeast. Lyophilization is not very gentle, it's very harsh. Brewing yeast are very sensitive compared to wine yeast, compared to baking yeast. They're very sensitive to temperature. So you need to dry them gently. So the process is called fluidized bed dryer. It's basically the yeast is in suspension into hot air. And when I say hot, it's not that hot, 30 degree, 35 degree max. And the yeast cells will dry into this hot air, and then they will fall to the bottom of the vessel, and then they will be harvested. If you have an interest in this, we can do a whole different presentation just on how to produce dry yeast. It's fascinating. Would you consider Brettanomyces strain? So yes, that was very high on the agenda. The issue with Brettanomyces is it's a non-Saccharomyces strain like Philly Sour. It doesn't dry very well. So to have a dry product on the market, we want to make sure the product is stable and consistent. And Brettanomyces, they mutate quite easily and they're very difficult to dry. So at the moment, we do not have one in the pipeline, but we are looking at this very carefully. I personally think that would be a great thing to have, because you could just use it to flavor or for aging. And since, again, it's only available in liquid, you can find some Brettanomyces in liquid form, but to dry is very difficult. And then the profile of the Verdun IPA, again, you can find this on the technical data sheet, and you can find it on the IPA best practice that I will send through afterwards. So I'm thinking technical data sheet for all the yeast. I'm thinking all the best practices on sour beer, IPA, Voss, how to reuse yeast if you are interested in that, rehydration, what else? Quality. All of this I will put in a little package for you. Any other questions on anything at this point? I know we're running out of time. Did you
I
find
have
this?
a quick question,
Yeah.
Sylvie.
Mm-hmm.
What about after harvesting the yeast? What about storage wise?
Yes.
Do you have any
Yeah, absolutely. That's very important. So if you do not transfer the yeast from cone to cone, the things to look at when you store the yeast is store it cold. So when you harvest the yeast, you want to get rid of, you don't want it sitting with a lot of beer on top of it. So harvest the yeast, put it in a sterile container. So we don't need something fancy. Even a bucket is good, even a plastic bucket, but it needs to be disinfected. It needs to be super clean. You don't want anything coming in that beer. You want to have a lid on it, and you want to keep it cold at 4 degrees Celsius. Do not freeze it, but keep it cold. And you want to keep it, I would say, 1 week max. 2 weeks would be stretching, but some yeast will be okay for 2 weeks. Again, lagers would be more sensitive. Ales can keep longer. Smell your yeast. That's the best way. That's the best way to see if it's happy. Smell it. When yeast starts to decline or to die, it's going to release some acid. It's going to start smelling. Okay, so smell your yeast every day and try to reuse it as soon as possible, but keep it cold. If you can also look at it under the microscope if you have a microscope, and you can do a quick staining to see how alive your population is. You can use something like methylene blue or methylene violet if you have a microscope, and look at how many live cells you have in there. You don't want to pitch something that's below 70% live cells. You're gonna have fermentation issues. So looking at viability, keeping it cold, and not keep it for too long. Those 3 things are very
amazing?
important.
Thank you very much. So just one more question, please. What about if we're talking about after storage and you repitch it? What about the temperature difference? Will it affect the yeast? Can they get a thermal shock or something?
Yeah, you may want to take out the yeast, but I wouldn't do it more than half an hour out of the fridge. You can let it warm up a little bit, but no, it's going to be fine. It's pretty resistant that way. So if you take it out of the fridge half an hour before you're going to pitch it, that should be fine for the yeast to warm up.
Cool. Thank you very much.
And then pitch it. Yeah.
Thanks.
I would have a follow-up question on that matter as well, about the pitching rate for reharvest or reused yeast.
The pitching rate when you harvest yeast? Is that was your question?
Yes.
Okay, so from dry yeast. So obviously, your first generation, you would have used dry yeast, and you pitch based on cell, based on dry weight, right? So we're gonna say, okay, you pitch 50 gram per hectoliter, 100 gram per hectoliter. Obviously, after that, if you want to reuse the yeast, your yeast is gonna be a slurry. It's not going to be dry anymore. So you got to treat it like if it's any other liquid culture, and you're going to pitch either per cell number. If you pitch per cell number, you need to have a microscope and you need to be able to count yourself. So you want to be able to pitch per weight is probably a lot easier, right? So you just have to, excuse me. If you pitch per weight, you just have to go and look at what the recommended pitching rate is for that specific yeast. That will be obviously we don't we don't recommend pitching rate. We only recommend pitching rate in terms of dry yeast. So if you want to reuse it and you want to pitch it in terms of weight, you're going to have to find, I can send you the best practice and see if it's in there, but otherwise you're going to have to follow traditional brewing recommendations, right? So, for example, if you're going to count the yeast, it's 1 million cell per Plato. That's the recommendation. And then you need to follow that recommendation for the weight as well. I don't have it in top of my head, but what I would say is then you fall under standard brewing recommendations. You don't follow dry yeast recommendation anymore. Yeah. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the first fermentation, you have the dry yeast. We give you the recommendation. After that, if you're going to reuse it, then you fall under traditional brewing. It's a liquid yeast now, and you need to follow the instruction regarding pitching according to traditional brewing procedures. Okay?
Wonderful. Yes, thank you.
Let me see. Okay, no more questions on the chat. I have put here our general, this is our general email, brewing@lallemand.com, but I think maybe Matti, you're going to send an email afterwards and my email will be on it as well with all the documents, right? So you can contact me directly as well.
All the chat and all the guys that now in the webinar, you can send me also.
Yes, the presentation, the technical data sheet, and the best practices we will send separately. So if you have any other questions, you can contact me directly, or this is our general email, or go on the website. There's lots of information on the website, lallamandbrewing.com. Okay?
Thank you, everybody that participated in this.
Thank you for joining. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mari.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.